Hello everyone. Welcome. Welcome back. Hi dear Alicia, how are you? Good morning. It is a good name. Welcome. Oh, good to hear. Thank you so much for joining, dear. Have a good day. Can you guess? No, I'm not Indian. Hello everyone, welcome. Comments are good names. Hi dear Adi, how are you? Welcome back. Good morning. Thank you so much. Uh, North UK. Karen. Hello dear Karen. How are you? Good morning. Good morning, brother. Have a good day. Hi, dear name day. Here is a beautiful name. How are you? Hello, dear early sun. Here is your good name. Hi, dear D. How are you? What? Hi, dear Naila. It is a beautiful name. Hello, dear Jania. Here is yours. Thank you so much for joining, everyone. Darcy. Okay. Hello, dear Darcy. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Hasinat. Here is yours. What a beautiful name you have, dear Hasinat. Is it fine? Hi, dear Veronica. Welcome back. Hello, dear Veronica. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Uspia. Here is yours. Thank you so much for joining. Hello, dear Zulia. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Parvez. Here is yours. Hello, dear Kanasya. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Tasneem. Here is yours. Thank you so much for joining. Hi, dear Nitya. Here is your beautiful name. Hello, dear Bilal. Here is yours. A and M. Hi, dear. Here is yours. Hello, dear Sarah. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear Molly. Here is yours. Hello, dear Samad. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Vaibhav. Here is yours. Thank you so much for joining, dear Webo. Here is yours. Hi, dear Sham. It is a good name. Hello, dear Hanan. Here is yours. Hi, dear Priya. Here is a beautiful name. Hello, dear Anabia. Here is yours. Hi, dear Devi. Here is your beautiful name. Hello, dear Aisha. Here is yours. Hello, dear Afan. Here is your beautiful name. Thank you so much for joining. Hello, dear Abigail. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Harita. Here is yours. Hello, dear Yashva. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Mushrifa. Here is yours. What a unique name you have. Thank you so much for joining. Hello, dear Chloe. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear Ankita. Here is yours. Thank you so much for joining, dear Ankita. Hello, dear Meena. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Kudrat. Here is yours. Kudrat. Hi, dear Sandeep. Here is your beautiful name. Hello, dear Nicole. Here is yours. Thank you so much for joining. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Hi, dear Mubina. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Ira. Here is yours. Hello, dear Anand. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear Rita. Here is yours. Okay, let's see who is next. Hi, dear Najwa. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Anika. Here is yours. Hello, dear Vani. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Lizia. Here is yours. Thank you so much for joining. Let's see who is next. Hi, dear victim. Here is your good name. Lizia. Hello, dear Lizia. Here is yours. Hi, dear Alisa. Here is your beautiful name. Thank you so much for joining. Don't forget to double tap on your screen, guys. Have a blessed Friday to all of you. Hi, dear Karma. Here is yours. Hello, dear Fahad. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear Georgia. Here is yours. Hello, dear Noah. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear Shania. Here is yours. Let's see who is next. Hi, dear Anaya. Sanaya and Anaya. What are rhyming names? Hi, dear Ayan. Here is yours. You're most welcome, dear. Lots of love. Hi, dear Niyati. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear Shanam. Here is yours. What a unique name you have, dear Shanam. Hi. Welcome back, Amul Bhai. How are you? Hi, dear Melina. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear Abdrish. Here is yours. Hello, dear Faris. Here is your good name. Hello, dear Emilia. Here is yours. Thank you so much for joining, dear Emilia. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Hi, dear Rukaya. Here is your good name. Hello, dear Suhana. Here is yours. Hello, dear Rashi. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Anya. Here is yours. Hello, dear Rehan. Here is your good name. Thank you so much for liking and subscribing. Hello, dear Shortcut. Here is yours. double tap on your screens and don't forget to press the subscribe button there. Let's see who is next. Hi, dear Pipa. Here is a good name. Hello, dear Hazel. Here is yours. Hi, dear Lavanya. Here is your good name. Hello, dear Sohail. Here is yours. Hi, dear Noha. Here is your good name. Hello, dear Ilit. Ilit. Here is yours. Hello, dear Firoz. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Ismail. Here is yours. Thank you so much for joining, everyone. Hi, dear Arifat. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear Hussein. Here is yours. Thank you so much for joining, dear Hussein. Hello, dear Maliha. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Sindhu. Here is yours. Let's see who is next. Hi, dear Liam. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Adina. Adanya. Here is yours. What a beautiful name you have, dear Adanya. Hi, dear Sajida. Here is your good name. Hello, dear Afan. Here is yours. Hello, dear Mahira. Here is your good name. Hello, dear Karima. Here is yours. Thank you so much for joining. Hello, dear Saliha. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Anshika. Here is yours. Thank you so much, dear. Thank you. Hi, dear Maybrit. Here is your good name. What a unique name you have, dear Maybrit. Hi, dear Aisha. Here is yours. Thank you so much for joining. Hello, dear Amy. Here is yours. Thank you for subscribing, dear. Lots of love. Hi, dear Yakub. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear Avanya. Here is yours. Uh, what is your name? Avinash. Sohail. Hello, dear Sohail. Here is yours. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Hi, dear Rachel. Here is yours. Oh, welcome back, Omar. Hello, dear Trisha. Here is a good name. Hi, dear Sam. Here is yours. Hello, dear Nitya. Thank you so much for subscribing, dear Nitya. Here is a good name. And don't forget to like and subscribe, guys. Let's see who is next. Hi, dear Zabi. Here is a good name. Just wait for a minute. Hi, dear Zoya. Here is yours. Hello, dear Turkan. Here is a beautiful name. Merhaba Nassan. Hi, dear Tranto. Here is yours. Hi, dear Isabel. Here is your beautiful name. Oh, so sorry. Amul Bhai. Hi, dear Vaibhav. Here is yours. Hello, dear Danya. Here is a good name. Can you guys hear me now? Okay, let's see who is next. Hi, dear Jason. Here is your good name. Hi, welcome. Happy birthday. Hi, dear Shibra. Here is yours. Yes, thank you so much for telling me. Hi, dear Donnie. Here is yours. Hello, dear Aylin. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear Vimar. Thank you for subscribing. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear Sunat. What a beautiful name you have. Here is yours. Hi, dear Vishali. Here is your beautiful name. Thank you so much for joining, everyone. Thank you, dear life. What is a good name? Hi, dear Cheyenne. Here is a beautiful name. Tanya and Vinay, welcome back. Tanya and Vinay. Here is yours. Hello, dear Noor. It is a good name. Hi, dear Mahika. Here is a beautiful name. Hi, dear Suraj. Here is yours. Thank you so much for joining, everyone. Don't forget to double tap on your screens. Hi, dear Marisa. Here is a good name. You're most welcome. Hi, dear Iyumi. Here is yours. Hi, dear Jay. Here is yours. Not yet, Amalai. Hi, dear Seema. Here is a good name. Hello, dear Adya. Here is yours. Hi, dear Divyanshi. Karuna. Okay. Divyanshi. Here is yours. Hello, dear Taruna. What a beautiful name you have. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Zion. Here is yours. Hello, dear Zuzia. Here is your beautiful name. Hello, dear Brar. Here is yours. Hi, welcome. Hello, dear Rosa. Here is your good name. Hi. Hello, dear Shive. Here is yours. You're most welcome, dear. Thank you so much. Hello, dear Brothers and Isabella. Hello, dear Isabella. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Vilo. Here is yours. What's a good name, dear? Sarah is your name. Hi, dear Sahana. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear Emmeline. Here is yours. Hello, dear Munya. Here is your beautiful name. What a nickname you have, dear. You're most welcome. Hello, dear Yuvan. Welcome back. Hi, dear Sana. Here is your beautiful name. Hello, dear Kia. Here is yours. Hi, dear Amy. Here is your beautiful name. Hello, dear Elora. Here is yours. Thank you. You're most welcome. Hi, dear Rutira. Here is your beautiful name. Don't forget to like and subscribe, guys. Hi, dear Dia. Here is yours. Hello, dear Kanchana. Here is your beautiful name. And hi, dear Thais. Here is yours. Hello, dear Shaheen. Here's a good name. Double tap on your screens. Hello, dear Anna. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Usher. Here is yours. Hello, dear Rahini. I like that emoji. Here is your good name. Hello, dear Mike. Mike, here is yours. Hello, dear Rahini. Rahini was done, no? Okay, here is yours. Hello, dear Arohi. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear Kiada. Here is yours. What a unique name you have. Hello, dear Yashu. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear Elvin. Here is yours. Hello, dear Behlil. It is a good name. Thank you so much for joining. Hi, dear Arnav. Here is your beautiful name. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Hello, dear Altaf. Here is yours. Hello, dear Huistros. Here is yours, dear. Let's see who is next. Hi, dear Zabel. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Abhinav. Here is yours. Hello, dear Sadia. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear Vox. Here is yours. Hello, dear Shafura. Let me add the question. Okay. Oh, lots of love. Thank you. Hi, dear Kyrie. Here is your beautiful name. Hello, dear Harim. Here is yours. Hello, dear Dravya. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear Jiva. Here is yours. Calm down. Baby, calm down. Hi, dear Usab. Here is yours. Hello, dear Nuha. It is a good name. Hello, dear Akka. Here is a good name. Hello, dear Sushant. Here is yours. Thank you so much for joining, everyone. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Hi, dear. What's your name? Alia. Hello, dear Alia. So good to have you here. Here is your beautiful name. Hello, dear Maria. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Alastair. Here is yours. Hello, dear Husna. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Nicole. Here is yours. Hello, dear Santiago. Here is your good name. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Bashir, what is your good name, dear? Hi, dear Anjum. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear Cap. Here is yours. Hello, dear Emilia. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear Ankush. Here is yours. Hello, dear Shiza. Here is your good name. Hello, dear Risky. Here is yours. Hello, dear Safa. Here is your good name. Thank you so much for joining, everyone. Lots of love. Don't forget to double tap on your screens. Hello, dear Nisha. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear File. Here is yours. Hello, dear Zimal. Here is your beautiful name. Thank you so much for joining. Hi, dear Yuki. Here is yours. Don't be sad. Hello, dear Isha. Here is yours. Hi, dear baby. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Malek. Here is yours. Hello, dear Elsie. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear Habiba. Here is yours. Have a blessed Friday to all of you. Hello, dear Kritika. Here is your good name. Jasmine. Hi, dear Jasmine. Here is your beautiful name. Thank you so much for joining, dear Jasmine. Hi, dear Kyrie. Here is yours. Hello, dear Maya. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear Usama. Here is yours. Thank you so much for joining. Hello, dear Shri. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Mahi. Here is yours. Hello, dear Silma. Here is your beautiful name. Hello, dear Shahazin. Here is yours. Let's see who is next. Hello, dear Binod. Here is your good name. Hello, dear Akil. Here is yours. Hi, dear Ehsan. Here is a good name. Hello, dear Ayusha. Here is is your beautiful name? Thank you so much for your patience, dear. Don't forget to double tap on your screens, and there is a subscribe button waiting for your finger press. Hi, dear Nasser. Here is your beautiful name. Hello, dear Lela. Here is yours. Hi, dear Salma. Here is your beautiful name. Hello, dear Chinu. Here is yours. Hi, dear Roxy. Roxy, what a unique name you have, dear Roxy. Here is yours. Hi, dear Janya. Here is your beautiful name. Hello, dear Adarsh. Here is yours. Hello, dear Monu. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear Adarsh. Here is yours. Thank you so much for joining. Hello, dear Lily. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Saliha. Here is yours. Hi, dear Talia. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear Rafia. Here is yours. Hello, dear Agatha. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Safira. Here is yours. Hello, dear Kavya. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Zaira, here is yours. Thank you so much for joining, everyone. Don't forget to double tap on your screens. Syra or Sina? Let me check. Syra or Sina, dear. What's a good name? Okay. Hi, dear Aditya. Here is a good name. Hello, dear Zad. Here is yours. Hello, dear Khadija. Walaikum assalam. Here is a beautiful name. Hi, dear Malu. Here is yours. Hello, dear Hatri. Here is a beautiful name. Hi, dear Rahmat. Here is yours. Thank you so much for joining. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Hi, dear Nara. Here is yours. Hello, dear Sabu. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Lamia. Here is yours. Hello, dear Emily. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear Anurag. Here is yours. Thank you so much for joining, dear Anurag. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Hi, let's see who is next. Piska. Hello, dear Piska. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Geet. Here is yours. Hello, dear Rudra. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Azi. Here is yours. Hello, dear Delilia. Delilia. Here is your good name. Hello, dear Julia. Here is yours. Hi, dear Jane. Here is a good name. Hello, dear Ellen. Here is yours. Hi, dear Elvish. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear Musa. Here is yours. Hello, dear Payal. How are you? Hello, dear Salem. Here is yours. Okay, let's see who is next. Dila. Delila. Okay. Thank you so much for correcting me. Hi, dear Chaya. Here is your good name. Double tap on your screens and let's see who is next. Hi, dear Elena. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Theo. Here is yours. Hello, dear Miriam. is your beautiful name. Hi, dear Chloe. Here is yours. Thank you so much for joining, dear Chloe. Hi, dear Yash. Here is yours. Hello, dear Arpita. Arpita, not Aspita. Hello, dear Arpita. Here is your good name. Hi, dear honey. Here is yours. Hello, dear Zarif. Here is your good name. What a unique name you have. Hello, dear Asma. Here is yours. Hi, dear. Thank you for subscribing, dear Divya. Divya or Dia? Dia. Hello, dear Dia. Thank you so much for subscribing. Hi, dear Hawa. Here is your beautiful name. Hello, dear Yogita. Here is yours. Hello, dear Thelma. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear Selma. Ashik. Here is yours. Hi, welcome, dear Angel. How are you? Hello, dear Angel. Here is your beautiful name. Oh, you're most welcome. Hello, dear Wingsat. Here is yours. Hi, dear Daniel. Here is your good name. Hello, dear Kushi. Here is yours. Hello, dear Annie. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear Rania. Here is yours. Hi, my name is Grace. Hello, dear Grace. How are you? Have a good day. Hi, dear Rim Jim. Here is your beautiful name. I am doing good. How about you? Welcome back. Hello, dear Ishu. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear Sarabi. Here is yours. Hello, dear. Who is saying Dracula? Hi, dear Radhe. Here is a good name. Hello, dear Farva. Here is yours. Hi, dear Nikita. Here is your beautiful name. Double tap on your screen and don't forget to press the subscribe button there. Samara. Hello, dear Samara. Here is your beautiful name. Emilia, another Emilia we have. Welcome, dear Emilia. How are you? What a beautiful name you have. Hello, dear Basir. Here is yours. Hi, dear Indian. Here is yours. Unique name. Hi, dear Maria. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear Ishwarya. Here is yours. Thank you so much for joining, dear Ashwarya. Hello. Oh, thank you. Lots of love. I really appreciate that. Hi, dear Husman. Here is a good name. Glad you liked it. Hi, dear Kiki. Here is your beautiful name. Hello, dear sunshine. You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. You make me happy when I'm sad. Hi, dear Rita. Here is your good name. Hello, dear Susie. Here is yours. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining Medicine. Hello, dear Medicine. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear Asmat. Here is yours. Hi, Amulbhai. Is everything all right? Hi, dear Hafi. Here is your good name. Hello, dear Adarsh. Here is yours. Hi, dear Sandra. Here is your beautiful name. Let's see who is next. Hi, dear Darun. Here is yours. It's okay, Amulai. No problem. Hi, dear Michael. Here is yours. Hello, dear Rahima. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear Max. Here is yours. Thank you so much for joining, everyone. Don't forget to double tap on your screen and let's see who is gonna be the next subscriber. Hi, dear Sumer. Here is yours. Hi, dear Deep. Here is yours. Hello, dear Chuvita. Let me correct myself. Chuvita. Here is yours. What a unique name you have. Hi, dear Ali. Here is yours. Hi, dear Ryan. Here is your good name. Hello, dear Zia. Here is yours. Hello, dear Buddy. Here is a good name. Hi, dear Afsana. Here is your beautiful name. Let's see who is next. Hi, dear Buffalo. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear Olia. Here is yours. Thank you so much for joining. Hi, dear Ankit. Here is your good name. Hello, dear Raya. Here is yours. Hello, dear Raya and Ria. Hello, both of you. Hi, dear Sufyan. Here is your good name. Hello, dear Leon. Here is yours. Hello, dear Hadia. Here is your beautiful name. Hello, dear Jasmeet. Here is yours. Thank you so much for joining. Hi, dear Akib. Here is yours. Double tap on your screens and don't forget to press the subscribe button there, guys. Double tap on your screens. Hi. Hope you remember my name. What's a good name? Hello, dear Elze. Here is yours. What do you don't know? Don't know about? Hello, dear Sahana. Here is yours. Hello. Hi. Let me check the name of you. Neha. Hello, dear Neha. Here is yours. Yeah. Hello. What's a good name? It's Elsie. Hi, dear. Okay, here is yours. Hello, dear Faraz. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear Arshad. Here is yours. Let's see who is next. Raihan. Hello, dear Raihan. Here is your good name. Hello, dear Jazz. Here is yours. Hi, dear Suk. Here is your good name. Hello, dear Tabassum. Here is yours. What a beautiful name you have. I am good. How about you? Thank you so much for asking, dear. Hello, dear Adriel. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear Shubo. Here is yours. Hello, dear Rohini. Here is a good name. Hello, dear Sarah. Here is yours. Hello, dear Ursulan. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear Samrat. Here is yours. Hello, dear Lucky. Here is yours. Hi, dear Hira. Here is your beautiful name. Hello, dear Nasser. Here is yours. Hello, dear. Hi, I am Vasundra. Please take my. Oh, what are you doing? Vasundra. Okay. Hello, dear Vasundra. It is a beautiful name. Thank you so much for joining, everyone. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And let's see who is next. Hello, I will be really happy if you write. What's a good name? Definitely, I'll write yours. Hi, dear Eva. Hello, dear Emilka. Here is a beautiful name. Hi, dear Nazli. Here is yours. Hello, dear Uvaz. Here is a good name. Ishal. Hello, dear Ishal. Here is yours. Thank you so much for joining. Please, Yamal. What a beautiful name you have, dear Yamal. Here is a good name. Okay, guys, don't forget to double tap on your screens and let's see who is next. Julissa. Hi, dear Julissa. Here is a beautiful name. Hi, dear Julissa and Melissa. Rhyming names. Hi, dear Melissa. Here is yours. Hi, dear Aman. It is a good name. Hello, dear Eliza. Julissa, Melissa, and Eliza. Wow. Here is yours. You're most welcome. Thank you so much. Hi, dear Ayaka. Here is yours. Hello, dear Adri. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Himasa. Here is yours. Hello, dear Jenny. Here's a good name. Hi, dear Monica. Here is yours. Thank you so much for joining, dear Monica. Here is your tacos. That's my name. What a delicious name you have, dear tacos. Here is yours. Hi, dear Sarani. Here is yours. Hello, dear Adarsh Rostan. Hi, that's Loco. Hello, dear Loco. Here is yours. Hi, dear Zenat. Here is a beautiful name. Hi, dear Ilham. Here is yours. Thank you so much for joining, dear Ilham. Nice meeting you. Hi, dear Bilkis. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear Daper. Here is yours. Let me check the spelling. Al Mohra. Al Mohra. What a unique name you have, dear Al Mohra. Let's try it for you. Al Mohra. And let's see who is next. Let me adjust the sound. Okay, now it's perfect. Hi, dear old school. Here is yours. Thank you so much for joining. I'm back again today. I am staying here. Oh, thank you. Hi, dear Farhan or Farah. Here is yours. Hello, dear Zakia. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear Tara. Here is yours. Hi, dear Umran. Here is your beautiful name. Hello, dear Faiha. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Aaron. Here is yours. Hello, dear Alyan. It is a beautiful name. Hi, dear Asel. Here is yours. Hi, dear Alyan was done now. Hi, dear Taru. Here is yours. Alake. Hello, dear Alake. Here is your unique name you have. Hello, dear Abisana's dental, I think. Here is yours. Hello, dear Shashank. Here is your beautiful name. Thank you so much for joining. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Hello, dear Tanme. 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 Here is yours. Hi, dear Inaya. Here is a good name. Hi, dear Max. Here is yours. Hello, dear Mila. Mila or Mila? Here is yours. Let me drink some water. Stay hydrated, guys. Hi, Ibrahim. Welcome. Just give me 1 minute. Okay, let's back to the names. Hi, dear Dana. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Hashi. Here is yours. Hello, dear sailor. Here's a good name. Hi, dear TUGCE. It is yours. Where are you from, man? Hello, dear Elendra. Here is yours. Hi, dear Lana. It is a good name. Let's see who is next. Rania. Hello, dear Rania. It is a good name. Hello, dear Ibrahim. Here is yours. You're most welcome, dear. Thank you so much. Hi, dear Josha. Here is yours. You are from Sri Lanka. Oh, good to have you here. Hi, dear Ray, and here is yours, Deep Sita. What a beautiful name you have, dear Deep Sita. Here is yours. Hi, dear Macy. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Lucky. Here is yours. Hello, dear. Let's see who is next. Lucky is done. Nuha. Hello, dear Nuha. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Javeria. Here is yours. Hello, dear Ubad. Here is a good name. Hi, dear me here. Here is yours. Hello, dear Javeria. Here is a good name. Hi, dear Fahima. Here is a good name. Hello, dear Ralph. Here is yours. Hi, Banu. Welcome back. I am good. How about you, dear? Banu. It is a good name. Thank you so much, dear Nisu, for subscribing. Here is yours. Okay, Macy. Macy, here is yours, dear, again. And if you want a screenshot, go for it now. You can watch my live later too. Leah, please, I am your biggest fan in my family. Hi, dear Leah, so sweet of you. Thank you so much. And just wait for a minute, guys. Just give me 1 minute. Macy is taking screenshot of her name. My name is Ishad. You are lucky too, cause you're right. Lucky is always lucky because lucky is lucky. Wow, 50 shades of lucky. Hi, dear Rahim. Here is yours. Hi, dear Gurpreet. Here is a beautiful name. Thank you so much for joining. Hello, dear Dasan. Here is yours. Hello, dear Jaytan. Here is your good name. Hello, dear Noor. Here is yours. Thank you so much for joining, guys. Let's see who is next. Hi, dear Samira. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, Asma. Welcome back. How are you? So good to have you here again, dear. Thank you so much for joining. Hello, dear Oswin. Here is yours. Thank you so much for joining again, dear Oswin. Here is yours. Hi, dear Neil. Here is yours. Hello, dear Darcy. Here is your good name. Hello, dear Shakil. Here is yours. Don't forget to like and subscribe, guys. Let's see who is next. The song that is stuck in my head is Pink Here by Katy and Last Life by Zara. Uh-huh. Hi there, Tyler. Oh, God. Ignore the background noises. Here is a good name. Hello, dear Umar. Here is yours. Hi, dear Nilesh. Nilesh. Here is yours. Hi, dear Sharina. Here is your beautiful name. Hello, dear Jumesa. Here is yours. Uh, Hi, dear Anis. Here is yours. You are right. Hi, dear Momina. Here is your good name. Let's see who is next. Hi, dear Ragiba. Here is your good name. What a unique name you have, dear. Hello, dear Fatima. Here is yours. Hello, dear Sunny. Here is a good name. Hi, dear Anju. Here is yours. Hello, dear Verda. Verda. I am writing a Verda. Here is yours. Hello, dear Hamza. Here is your good name. Thank you so much for joining. Don't forget to press the subscribe button there and double tap on your screens. I want precious. Okay. Hi, dear Eva. Here is your beautiful name. Hello, dear Sheila. Here is yours. Hi, dear Hanya. Here is your beautiful name. Hello, dear Tanvir. Here is yours. Hi, dear Priya. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear Shreya. Priya and Shreya. What are rhyming names? Hello, dear Minza. Here is your good name. Thank you so much for joining. Hi, dear Sahna. Here is yours. Can you tell me mine? Why not? What's a good name? Amy. Hello, dear Amy. Here is yours. Hi, dear Bella. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear Arohi. Here is yours. Thank you so much for joining, dear. You're most welcome, dear Amy. Hi, dear Abrish. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Kennel. Here is yours. Hello, dear Madhu. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear Cherry or Cheryl? Cheryl or Cherry? Let me find your comment. Can you comment again, dear Cheryl? Because I just missed your comment and couldn't find. Cherry or Cheryl? Hey, dear Cherry, where are you? Cheryl. Thank you so much for commenting again. Let's see who is next. Hi, dear Annie. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Sebastian. Here is yours. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Hi, dear Natty. Here is yours. Hello, dear Sanavi. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear Muhammad. Here is your beautiful name. Thank you so much for joining. Hello, dear Grace. Here is yours. Hi, dear Esma. Here is your beautiful name. Hello, dear Shajid. Here is yours. Fatima. Hello, dear Fatima. Here is your good name. Hello, dear Josefa. Here is yours. Let's see who is next. Hi, dear Espa. Here is your good name. Hello, dear Shanta. Here is yours. Hi, dear Natsuki. Here is yours. Hi, dear Deva. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Hesla. Here is yours. What a unique name you have. Oh, you're most welcome. Thank you for joining. Hi, dear Diksha. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear Stay. Here is yours. Hi, I am good. How about you, Nitik? Here is yours. Hello, dear Tunis. Here is a good name. Hello, dear Inara. Here is yours. Good to hear. Hi, dear Naveed. Here is yours. Hello, dear Chewy. Here is a good name. Hi, dear Akhat. Here is yours. What a unique name you have, dear Akhat. Hello, dear Umar. Here is yours. Fatima. Hi, dear Advik. Here is yours. Yes. Let's see who is next. Oh my god, Devil. Hello, dear Devil. Here is yours. Hello, dear Abiha. It is a good name. Hi, dear Anas. Here is yours. Hello, dear Dil Nawaz. Here is yours. Thank you so much for joining. Double tap on your screens and don't forget to press the subscribe button. Subscribe. Hi, dear Nehal. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Mia. Here is yours. Hi, dear Swata. Here is a good name. Hello, dear Saqib. Here is your Saqib and Ali. Hello, dear Arya. Here is yours. Hi, Master D. Welcome back. How are you? Hello, dear Neha. Here is yours. Master D. Welcome. Hello, dear Kenza. Here is your good name. Sorry, I don't understand this language. Can you please write in English? Dila. Hi, dear Dila. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear Maja. Here is yours. Hello, dear Ivavia. Wow, what a unique name you have, dear Ivavia. Here is yours. Hi, dear Audrey. Here is your good name. You're most welcome, dear. Hello, dear Mohib. Here is yours. Hi, dear Leia. Here is your good name. Hi, dear A and S. Here is yours. Hello, dear Ananta. Here is your beautiful name. Hello, hi. Hi, dear me. So here is yours. Gayatri. Let me check the spelling, dear. Gayathm and I. What a unique name you have, dear. Shiro, do you know Sinhala? Can you speak Sinhala? Okay, Sinhala. No, I don't know the language. If the Sinhala is the language, then I don't know about anything. But if the name, so here is yours. Hi, dear Eric. Here is yours. Hello, dear Jacoby. It is a good name. Hi, dear Om. Here is yours. Hi, what's a good name, dear? Are you Bushra? Tegan. Hello, dear Tegan. Here is yours. Thank you so much. Lots of love. Are you Bushra, dear? Sinhala is Sri Lankan language. Oh, no, I don't speak Sinhala language. I don't know how to speak. But yeah, I can learn for you some greeting phrases for you, dear. Hi, dear Coco. Here is yours. Hello, dear Heaven. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear A and N. Here is yours. Let's see who is next. Okay, Piyush. Hello, dear Piyush. Here is yours. And let's try the name Puratchi. Here is yours. Thank you so much for joining, dear. I can't pronounce this. Hi, dear Gurbi. It is a good name. Hi, dear Pramod. Here is yours. Let's see who is next. Coco. Coco. Melon. Hi, dear Coco. Here is yours. Thank you so much for joining. Hi, dear Gulnaz. Here is yours. Kirtan. Hello, dear Kirtan. Here is your beautiful name. Thank you so much for joining. Hi, dear Chetu. Here is yours. Triple tap on your screens and don't forget to press the subscribe button. Hi, dear Soumya. Here is a good name. Hi, dear Easter. Here is yours. Tashakiradaram. Hello, dear Aya. Here is yours. Hi, dear Amen. Here is yours. Hello, dear. Thanks for the coffee. Oh, wow. Oh, God. Hi. Hi, dear Haifa. Here is your beautiful name. What's a good name, dear Bisma Zana? What's a good name? You have to tell your name, dear. How do I know about your name? Hi, dear Nori. Here is yours. Yes, I am all right. Elia. Hello, dear Elia. Here is yours. Baht. Okay. Oh, T-A. Let me rewrite. Bakht. Baht. Thank you so much for joining, dear Baht. It is a good name. Oh, thank you. Let's see who is next. Rayhan. Hello, dear Rayhan. Here's a good name. Hi, dear Yasu. Here is yours. Hello, dear Ame. Here is yours. CR. Hi, dear Hadia. Here is a good name. Thank you so much for joining, everyone. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And my mom is cooking food, and the aroma of the food is like. Let me drink some water. Just wait for a minute. Okay, let's back to the next name. Basis. Hello, dear Basis. Here is a good name. Hi, dear Nisfa. Here is yours. Hello, BTS Army. Guys, don't forget to double tap on your screens and take on. Don't need to please me, dear. Take on. Here is yours. Oh, thank you so much. You are the cutest. Thank you, dear. Hi, dear Manu. Here is yours. Tapa. Yep. Hello, dear. Don't know why I wrote this. Yep. Hello, dear Iman. Here is a good name. Hi, dear Anaya. Here is yours. Kimanab. Cut? You mean cute? Let me check the spelling, guys. Kimanab. What a unique name you have, dear Kimanab. Here is a good name. Oh, thank you so much for liking and subscribing. Hi, dear Vanessa. Here is yours. You was going to screenshot, but it's okay. I can write again for you, dear Tegan. Here is yours, and if you want a screenshot you can take it now and you can watch my live later as well. And your beautiful name is done at 1 hour and 6 minutes of the live. So guys, don't forget to double tap on your screens and let's see Ozzy. Okay, dear Ozzy, hold on. Thank you for the subscription. Here is a good name. Hi, dear Cheyenne. Here is yours. Thank you for liking and subscribing. Lots of love to all of you. Hi, dear Jessie. Here is yours. Hi, dear Ishraq. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Dahayu. Here is yours. Hello, dear Bushra. Here's a beautiful name. I am here. Welcome. Oh, Sophie. Hi, dear Sophie. How are you? Good morning, dear. Have a good day. Saifullah. Hi, dear Saifullah. Here is your beautiful name. Thank you so much for joining. Hello, dear Rifki. Welcome back, dear Rifki. How are you doing today? Hello, dear Rio. Here is yours. Hi, dear Rivati. Here is a good name. Let's see who is next. Thank you so much for subscribing, dear. Hello, dear Emma. Here is yours. Why not? Here is your name. Hi, dear Mehmet. Here is yours. Yourselves and merhaba. Hi, dear Sehaj. Here is yours. Hello, dear Tanveer. How are you? Here is a good name. My name is Ishal. Hi, dear Sachi. Here is yours. Hello, dear Arshad. Here is a good name. Hello, V. Hi, dear Lizzie. Happy birthday, dear Lizzie. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Hi, dear Ace. Here is yours. Hello, dear Melike. Here is yours. Hi, dear Aisha. Here is a good name. Thank you so much for joining. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's see who is next. Zeraldo. What a unique name you have, dear Zeraldo. Here is yours. Okay, Bob. You want a screenshot of your name? You can watch my live later too, and your Good name is done at 1 hour and 10 minutes of the live. Guys, double tap on your screens and don't forget to press the subscribe button there. Hi dear Ahmad. Here is a good name. Is the stream is lagging? Hi dear Sabo. Here is yours. Hello dear Macy. Here is a good name. Hi dear Fazil or Faza. Fazil. Hi dear Fazil. Here is a beautiful name. Hello, dear Ashi. Here is yours. Hi, dear Lela. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Darshana. Here is yours. How are you? Hello, dear Vicky. Here is yours. Hi, dear Aisha. Aisha. Here is yours. Missy needs a screenshot. Missy, if you want a screenshot, your good name is done at 1 hour and 11 minutes. So you can watch my live later too, dear. Hi, dear Agna. Here is yours. Hi, dear Kinsel. Here is yours. Hi, dear Rani. Here is a good name. You're most welcome, dear. Lots of love. Have a good day. Hi, dear Tricia. Here is a good name. You're most welcome, dear. Thank you. Konima. Here is yours. What a unique name you have, dear Konima. Here is yours. Hi, dear Abrar. Here is your good name. Hello, dear Olivia. Here is yours. Hi, dear Mira. Here is your good name. Hello, dear Jalal. Here is yours. Okay, okay. Mira. Just for you, dear Sophie. Let's see who is next. Suguru. Hi, dear Suguru. Here is your good name. Hello, dear Talha. Here is yours. Hi, dear Zara. Here is your beautiful name. Hello, dear Inaya. Here is yours. Double tap on your screens and don't forget to press the subscribe button there. Hello, dear Nisa. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear Ahelam. Here is yours. Thank you. You're most welcome. Hi, dear Rio. Here is yours. Hello, dear Madison. Here's a good name. Hi, dear Precious. Here is your beautiful name. What a name. Beautiful. And oh my god, please don't spam. Hi, dear Dave. How are you? Here is your good name. Hi, dear Julia. Here is your beautiful name. Hello, dear Heaton. Here is yours. Hello, dear Vedhi. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear Asia Western Misa. Misa, here is yours. Hi, welcome back. Dear Aditya, here is a good name. Hello, dear Kokichi. What a cute name you have. Kokichi. Kokichi. Am I pronouncing it right? Hello, dear Shok. How are you? Hi, dear Amy. Here is your beautiful name. Hello, dear Rani. Here is yours. Hi, dear Rafa. Here is your good name. Hello, dear Reshma. Reshma. Here is yours. Hello, dear Baha. Here is your good name. Double tap on your screens and don't forget to press the subscribe button there. Kevin, welcome back. How are you? Good day to you too, dear Kevin. It is a beautiful name. Thank you so much for joining. Hi, dear Louis. Here is yours. Hello, dear Hamida. Here is your beautiful name. Jesus. Okay. For you, dear. Hello, dear Fatma. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear Satoru. Here is yours. Hello, dear Elnas. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Bella. Here is yours. Let's see who's next. Zimal. Hello, dear Zimal. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Lana. Here is yours. Hello, dear Vihan. Here is your good name. Hi, dear chicken flying ghost. Jonas. Here is yours. Hello, dear. Let's see who is next. Jonas is done. Zola. How are you? Hello, dear Abu Huraira. Welcome back. How are you? Here is your beautiful name. Thank you so much for joining. Let's see who is next. Thank you so much for joining, everyone, and don't forget to like and subscribe. क्या मिस किया है मैंने? Oh God. Hello, dear Noor. Here is your screenshot. I screenshotted your comment and बाद में पढ़ती हूँ ज़रा ठहरो मुझे भाई. Hi, dear Jay. Here is yours. Hello, dear Uwais. It is a good name. Hi, dear Nicholas. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear Banas. Here is yours. Hi, dear Abisan is done now. Shakira. Hello, dear Shakira. Here is yours. Are you are you talking about the song which is stuck on your mind, or are you answering the question, or your name is Shakira? Oh, I am confused. Hi, dear Keisha. Here is your beautiful name. Hello, dear Hari. Don't be sad. Here is yours. Oh my God, lots of spam. Hi, dear Krishna. Here is your good name. Kara. Hello, dear Kara. Here is a good name. Thank you so much for joining. And don't forget to press the subscribe button there. Double tap on your screens. And let's see who is now. Oh my god, please don't spam. Please, please. Thank you so much. Oh my god, too much spam. Kevin, lots of love, dear Kevin. Thank you. Hi, dear Grisha. Here is yours. Hello, dear Abdurrahman. Here is your beautiful name. Let's see who is next. नहीं बिल्कुल भी. Hi, dear Raman. Here is yours. Hi, dear Shahad. Here is your good name. Hello, dear Trisha. Here is yours. Hello, dear Lily. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear Gurleen. Here is yours. Double tap on your screen. Prince. Hello, dear Jody. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Asiya. Here is yours. Shahad. Oh, what a beautiful name. Hi, dear Zoe. Here is yours. Hi, dear Anastasia. Here is your beautiful name. Anastasia. Hello, dear Sarah. Here is yours. Hi, dear Pico. Here is your beautiful name. Hello, dear Kalai. Here is yours. Okay, okay. Let me check the spelling and Arindam. 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 Am I pronouncing it right? And sorry if I pronounced your name wrong, but I don't know how to pronounce this. Arindam. Hi, dear Lara. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Avya. Iva, here is yours. Hello, dear Amir. Here is a good name. Hi, dear Ben. Here is yours. Hello, dear. What? Hi, dear Ronak. Here is yours. Hi, dear Lenny. Here is a good name. Hi, dear Fire. Here is yours. Hello, dear Maria. Here is your beautiful name. Hello, dear Piyush. Here is yours. Hi, dear Anushka. Here is your beautiful name. Let's see who is next. Hi, dear Usman. Here is yours. Hello, dear Rachita. Here is a good name. Okay, humor, hold on. Hello, dear Uday. Here is yours. Let me rewrite. Okay, let's see who is next. My voice is lagging because I am thirsty. And let me drink some water. Till then, double tap on your screens and don't forget to press the subscribe button. Just give me 1 minute. One, just one. Yeshwa. Hello, dear Yeshwa. Here is yours. Hi, dear Hasek. Here is your good name. Hello, dear Laz. Here is yours. Hi, dear Art. Here is yours. Hello, dear Crystal. I just love your name, dear Crystal. Here is a beautiful name. Thank you so much for joining and don't forget to press the subscribe button. Hello, dear Alishba. Umi, okay. Here is yours. Hi, dear Umi. Here is your beautiful name. What a cute name you have. Hi, dear Samra. Here is yours. Please don't spam. Uves. Here is yours. Ayla. Hello, dear Ayla. Here is a good name. Hi, dear Falak. Here is yours. Hello, dear Abiha. Here is your beautiful name. Hi, dear Mahad. Here is yours. Alexandra. Hello, dear Alexandra. Here is yours. Hi, Ishal. Welcome. Hello, dear Isha. Here is yours. Hi, dear Ethan. Here is a good name. Double tap on your screen. We have to complete 200. And Rima. Hello, dear Rima. Here is yours. Hi, dear Shima. Here is a good name. Rima and Shima, two sisters. Hi, dear Bidare. Here is yours. Thank you so much for joining. Double tap on your screens. Hi, dear Sheila. Here is yours. Oh, dear Ansari. It is a good name. Hi, dear Hifza. Here is yours. Oh, literally, we are stuck on 183. Can we make it 187 at least? Oh, Bantika. Oh, Bantika. Here is yours. Right, Gume. Okay, dear Gume. OMG, I am back, dear Mila. Hello, dear Mila or Mila. Gume. Here is yours. Hi, dear Tuba. Here is a good name. Rachita. Hello, dear Rachita. Here is yours. You're most welcome, dear. Hi, dear Ishan. Here is yours. Hello, dear Noah. Here is a good name. Hi, dear Bailey. This is a good name. Thank you so much for joining, everyone. Don't forget to like and subscribe. नहीं कौन से वाले पुराने Anika. Hi, dear Anika. Here is yours. Hi, dear Jawad. It is a good name. Hello, dear Manu. Here is yours. Hi, dear Jovi. Here is yours. Hello, dear Zarish. Here is your good name. Double tap on your screen, guys. Come on. We have to complete 200. So please help us to reach that target. Hi, dear Abira. Don't know what is happening with my Siri. Hi, dear Nuri. Here is yours. Hello, dear Feya. Here is yours. Mehnaz. Hi, dear Mehnaz. Here is a good name. Hello, dear Sana. Here is yours. Hi, dear Naila. Here is yours. Hi, dear John. Here is yours. Hello, dear Yusuf. Here is a good name. Hello, dear Jacob. Here is yours. Hi, dear Arwen. Ayat. Here is yours. Hi, dear Ian. Here is yours. Hello, dear Harun. It is a good name. Hello, dear Absha. Here is yours. Hi, dear Tanya. Here is yours. Double tap on your screens. Come on. Hello, dear Alo. Here is yours. Hi, dear Avitas. Here is yours. Hi, dear Maybe. Thank you for subscribing. Hi, dear Lana. Here is yours. Hello, dear Suray. Suray or Suresi? Suresi. Here is yours. Hi, dear Sana. Welcome back. Here is yours. Hello, dear Farva. Here is a good name. Hi, dear Ayan. Here is yours. Hello, dear Gitali. Here is yours. Hi, dear Dua. It is a good name. Okay, Jacob, in the end of the live for sure. And I am going to end this after completing 200 likes. Shumaila. Hi, dear Shumaila. Here is yours. Hi, dear Summer. It is a good name. Hi, dear Giant. Here is yours. Hello, dear Jakya. Here is yours. Double tap on your screens and don't forget to press the subscribe button, guys. Hello, dear Vanda. Here is yours. Hi, dear Amaya. Here is a good name. Hello, dear Zahra. Here is yours. Hi, Sana. How are you doing today? Okay, dear Amaya. Here is yours. Hi, dear Elna. Here is a good name. Hello, dear Diego. Here is yours. Hi, dear Sidhu. Here is yours. I am good. How about you? Hi, dear Minahal. Here is yours. I am good too. Thank you so much for asking. And hello, dear Enora. Here is yours. I'll be back after 1 hour. Come on, Muslim Bhai. What are you saying? Hi, dear Zaki. Here is yours. And now we are going to write our last name for this stream, which is Tanvi is done now. Double tap on your screens and don't forget to press the subscribe button. Thyla. Hello, dear Thyla. Here is yours. Hi, dear Shahid. It is a good name. Hello, dear Fasya. Here is yours. Hi, Simena. ¿Cómo estás, Simena? Gracias. Hi, dear Ashley. One of my favorite names. Ashley. Here is yours. Hi, dear Nasir. Here is a good name. Okay, Jacob. Hi, dear Jode. Here is yours. Hi, dear Sean. Here is a good name. Hello, dear Enora. Here is yours. Hello, dear Snowy. Here is a good name. Hello, dear Arizona. Here is yours. Okay. Let's see who's next. Vandan. Hi, dear Vandan. Here is yours. Hello, hi. Thank you so much for joining, everyone. And now I am going to end this stream. Hello, dear Yusuf. Here is yours. Eva. It is a good name. Hi, dear Ragiba. And last name for this stream is Jacob. Jacob, are you here, man? Okay, I am good. How about you? Thank you so much for asking. Thank you for subscribing, everyone. Lots of love. I'll be back after 1 hour. Till then, take care. Love you all. Bye bye. Bye.